Welcome to Lorology. Sure, other courses might teach you about art or different languages, but here we talk about equally important things. Things like edgy space elves, beefy space elves, and the land that safe words forgot. I am your host, Loricus the Lore Master, and with me as always are my students, Brady and Seth. Say hi, boys.
Hi, boys.
Well, I'm glad you've joined us today, folks, because we have a very special treat for the class. We'll be going on a field trip.
I didn't get my permission slip.
I'm 12.
We'll be going on a field trip to none other than the most happening town in all of the 40K universe, Kumara. Of course, to avoid any legal snafus, I've been gently reminded by the board to include a little pre-trip lecture so everyone's aware of the history and the, let's say, unique habits of the locals. Now, quick content warning here. While a lot of 40K is pretty dark, the DRUKHARI are extremely so. So if drugs, torture, and murder aren't your thing, we've got a video on the Eldari that you can check out. For everyone else, prepare yourselves for the one faction that makes the Chaos cults seem personable. If you haven't seen our Eldari video, here's a quick rundown. Once upon a time, there were a bunch of psychic space elves who had literally everything they could ever want or need. This power could have been used to make things better for the thousands of species wiped out by a galaxy-wide war between gods, but instead, they just dedicated all their time to finding new ways to get their collective rocks off. The most sensible of them broke off. Some became warrior monks hoping to live lives of perfect balance, while others said nuts to this whole civilization thing and went off to become dinosaur-riding nomads. But the ones that stayed in the Empire got steadily more and more jaded by all the space drugs and started inventing new and progressively more horrifying ways to entertain themselves. Then, sometime during the 30,000th millennium, the 24-hour murder parties, combined with the raw psychic power of these homeworld Eldari, combined to create an angry demon god named Slaanesh, who proceeded to eat the gods and mark the souls of the entire species as the next thing on the menu. To cope with this, some wore special gemstones that would house their souls after death. Others, even now, are trying to create a new god that'll keep the souls of the dead safe and sound, kind of like Hades in Greek mythology. But then, there's the DRUKHARI.
There's always one. There's always a black sheep in the family. There's always the one who's like, hey, if it isn't the consequences of our own actions, and then they're like, nah,
we don't care.
Now, before the Eldari fell to the horror of Slaanesh, they'd figured out how to move through a series of interdimensional tunnels called the Webway. This was infinitely safer than traveling through the warp, since you were just navigating an interconnected network of stable wormholes, rather than traveling through actual literal hell! Now, the Webway was actually quite stable, and you could even live there, and more than a few Eldari actually did. See, because the Webway was effectively an artery carrying trade goods, supplies, and people across the galaxy, it only made sense that ports of trade would start popping up, and cities would eventually start to grow around those ports. Of all the cities, though, none was grander than Kumara. If you wanted anything from weapons to slaves to drugs, you went to Kumara. When the fall happened, the city suffered just as badly, since nothing quite disrupts the flow of trade like a demonic apocalypse. But the pleasure-obsessed cults that kickstarted the murderous hedonism of the Eldari to begin with managed to survive. They hid away in Kumara and began to re-establish their own Eldari society by bringing other survivors in. Some came in from real space, while others were native to the smaller port cities and were soon absorbed into the society as a whole. Over the centuries, the city expanded, absorbing smaller port cities and sub-realms. And since the Webway made the laws of physics more like suggestions, they could just keep growing infinitely. And thus, Kumara became what we know it today, a near-infinite city of infernal agonies, dizzying pleasure, and an economy entirely based on slave labor.
A whole economy.
It sounds like a really terrifying, awful version of Las Vegas.
Well, it wasn't long until the DRUKHARI realized that their species' culture of psychic mastery wouldn't exactly fly after Slaanesh's big buffet. See, Psychers work by making their souls into bridges between reality and the warp. By channeling the realm's thought energy into the physical world, one could make strange and seemingly magical phenomena happen. There lied the problem. You were making your soul a bridge to the warp. If the DRUKHARI did that, they'd more or less be opening the door for Slaanesh and ringing the dinner bell. So, the first thing they did was kill off their psychers and put a full-on ban on the practice. There would be no wizard shenanigans in Komara, no sir. Rather, like the Necrons or the Mechanicus, the Drukhari would focus on honing their scientific advancements until they could almost be mistaken for magic. They do still use psychic technology, but such devices are more stable and don't carry the same risks as a flesh and blood psyker might. But there was still a problem. See, the Asuryani were able to keep their souls through discipline, and the aforementioned soul stones. But even in the Webway, the Drukhari weren't safe from Slaanesh. It turns out that She Who Thirsts was able to slowly eat the Drukhari's soul bit by bit while they were still alive, kind of like licking the world's edgiest ice cream cone. Even with all the psychers dead or exiled, their souls were still slowly leaching into the warp piece by piece. They needed a solution, and they weren't about to go to the Asuryani. They didn't need help from those nerds. No, they had a much better idea. Well, better for them, worse for literally everybody else. While they couldn't stop Slaanesh from slowly eating bits of their souls, they could find ways to repair the damage. It was simple, really. All they needed to do was find sentient beings and make them suffer unthinkable levels of pain. They could then absorb the psychic energy made by their victim's agony and restore their own souls in a kind of psychic vampirism. Doing this, they could not only keep their souls from being entirely devoured, also they were effectively immortal. Well, so long as they kept feeding on the suffering of others, that is. Of course, you can only torture someone for so long before they start to, die. So, Drukhari will often emerge from the Webway to raid planets, starships, and anything else they can get their claws on, all in the name of gathering more victims to prolong their unnatural and terrible lives. Drukhari will even hunt down their own Asuryani relatives, seeing them as dim-witted weaklings who failed to grasp the galaxy-brained brilliance of their unsustainable torture economy. In fact, the capture and torment of other Eldari is considered high art in some circles, and some will even capture Eldari soul stones and find ways to weaponize the act of torturing the souls trapped inside.
Like, these guys, man, they're just, even for 40K, these are just next level sadist jerk-offs. They're just the worst.
Of course, even with their souls being constantly repaired, there was still the whole problem of, their race dying. They needed victims, and unfortunately, people had a tendency to fight back when they figured out the whole eternal torture thing was in their future. This meant any raid for slaves would likely cost them time and people. So, as is the trend, they figured out a solution that was, frankly, horrifying. Clones! That's right. Using the same medical science they used to keep their victims alive, even with most of their organs gone, the Drukhari were able to successfully create more of their own species. All they needed was a bit of genetic material, and they could make as many test tube babies as they liked. These vat-grown space elves, called half-born, found themselves at the bottom rung of Drukhari society, though some would be able to climb that social ladder thanks to ambition, cleverness, and a not small amount of murder. Drukhari born the old-fashioned way were called trueborn, and had more privileged upbringing due to being descendants of original homeworld Eldari. Now, before the fall, torture and murder were just hobbies of the Drukhari. Now they were a necessity for their survival. So it only makes sense that all of the major fixtures of Drukhari society are also organizations that revolve around torture, murder, and some combination of the two. For example, there's the witch cults, who, despite their name, these all-female warriors don't really do any magic. They're actually just a sect of gladiators who play a very important role in Drukhari society. See, blood sports are the simplest and most common way for Drukhari to feed on suffering. If you're feeling a little drained, just buy a ticket, take a seat, and watch these ladies fly through the air like acrobats before slicing someone to riddance. If you get a seat at the first few rows, be sure to get a poncho because you, my friend, are in the splash zone. Well, then there's the Homunculi, aka the Lords of Pain. These guys are like a mix of mad scientist and professional torturer. If the witches are churning out mass-produced agony for the common space elf, like cheeseburgers, the Homunculi are handcrafting some real artisanal suffering here. Think the Kobe beef of murder. Each homunculus possesses the unique ability to shape the flesh, bone, and souls of their victims as if they were clay. Doing this, they're able to create forms of deep pain that few others can match. They combined these terrible arts with their own brand of mad science. Some will literally brew potions and drugs made from things like pleas for mercy or dying screams. Others will create lurching monsters of metal and meat called pain engines. Most will even use their own flesh-shaping arts on themselves to turn their bodies into living drug factories so they can stay eternally buzzed on a cocktail of their favorite stimulants. Homunculi have also mastered technology that allows them to reincarnate into new bodies after death using scraps of flesh and enough pain to drag the soul from the warp into the body. The process is risky and may result in a demonic incursion, so tortured Eldari are best. This means even if you do manage to kill one, chances are he'll come back and hunt you down for some truly horrific revenge. Now, at the top of this pointy, sweaty pyramid are the Archons. Archons are fixtures in DRUKHARI society that run organizations called cabals. Each cabal is in charge of some vital aspect of DRUKHARI society, like weapons manufacturing, trade, entertainment, or drugs. They're also basically sovereign nations, complete with territories and standing armies. Promotions are hard to come by, what with the population being biologically immortal, which means the only way to get ahead in the game is to either kill someone above you or get them in so much trouble that they end up on someone's chopping block. So to be an Archon means you're constantly dealing with a web of betrayal, political maneuvering, and intrigue so tangled that it makes Game of Thrones look like Sesame Street. So to avoid being backstabbed by the more upwardly mobile members of their kind, Archons will often surround themselves with alien bodyguards. These vicious monsters usually have no skin in the game, so they have no reason to betray them, and their freaky appearances and strange powers double as a way to keep some of the more ambitious middle managers from feeling a bit too confident. Nothing says, "Try me, punk," like a bodyguard who's a 7-foot-tall, 4-armed snake man.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to mess with that.
Yeah, I feel like...
That's actually deviously brilliant when you think about it. Like, to have a bodyguard who has zero vested interest in betraying you, because then it's like, you don't bite the hand that feeds.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, a DRUKHARI in the society, like, the society is literally built such that someone who is not a DRUKHARI cannot move upward or gain anything other than to be paid to be there. So, like, that's devious, that's devilishly sly.
Yeah, and in this society, it's almost like impossible to trust anyone of your own species, because it seems like it's all...
You wouldn't even be able to trust your family,
if
like your kids.
Yeah, if you can't trust that you can stay in power, you can't trust those around you to support you at all.
Now, to look behind the curtain a bit, the DRUKHARI take a number of interesting influences. The obvious influence is Games Workshop's own marauding, slave-trading Dark Elves from Warhammer Fantasy. But the Dark Elves themselves borrow from Michael Moorcock's fantasy series Elric of Melniboné, in which the elf-like Melnibonéans grew bored with their long lifespans and built a civilization on slavery, bloodsport, and performative torture. And, like the Melnibonéans, the DRUKHARI have something of a complex relationship with the demonic forces of chaos. Yes, even chaos was, to some extent, inspired by its depictions in the Elric books, right down to its capricious demon gods and use of the 8-pointed star. That said, while the Melnibonéans did it entirely for entertainment and religious purposes, the DRUKHARI added an interesting twist by making it a matter of survival, giving them an eerie aspect of something vampiric. This, combined with the shambling flesh and metal horrors of the pain engines, racks, and homunculi, evoke elements of classic monster movies like Dracula and Frankenstein. Even the art of Komara and its twisting, jagged buildings evokes images of German expressionist horror like Nosferatu and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So, there we have it, boys. A brief look at the history, culture, and industry of Komara. I don't know about you guys, but I can't wait to visit. So, I'll be taking those permission slips, and then we can just get on the bus and... well, their loss. Well, what about you guys? Which is your favorite Cabal? What faction, character, or event should we cover next? Let us know in the comments below. Hit that like button to stave off Slanesh's hunger, and don't forget to subscribe to see more videos like these. Now, before I leave, if there's nothing else to take from this lecture, let it be this. What happens in Komara stays in Komara, whether it wants to or not. I've been Loricus, the Lore Master. Class dismissed!